At Brunswick, we aim to work with some of the most exciting companies in the world that are finding their leadership in terms of financial value hand in hand with social value. We all know that big companies have to deliver shareholder value. But there is a new paradigm coming through, which is companies which are choosing to do that hand in hand with delivering value to society at large, and there are very few companies which are doing that so visibly and with such commitment and imagination in the world today as Apple is. So it's a particular excitement for me to be sitting beside Angela. I've known this lady for a while, and she needs very little introduction. Having actually turned Burberry into a global fashion brand, propelled it onto a global stage, she was unsurprisingly hunted down by Tim Cook, and now she's propelling Apple Retail into a new gear completely. So I think for me, the opportunity here is to find out what's really front of mind for Angela. Now, I know that you've come pretty much straight off the plane from Dubai to visit us here with some smash successes in the last week behind you in Dubai. But I also know that there's a moment today, so we'll get back to Dubai in a minute and we'll stay with this moment. This is 3 years to the day, I'm told, that you joined Apple. So, wow, there is a journey and a half in those 3 years. And from the new girl 3 years ago to the day, to the big smash successes of Dubai last week, it's been an amazing time. How's it been? How would you say it's been?
Well, you said amazing, so it's been a journey. It's been, it's funny. People will say, "Has it been fun? Has it been?" And so it makes you really stop and think. And I think I told one gentleman about a week or so ago, I said, it's kind of like raising your children. At times it's the most frustrating, most challenging, but yet the most gratifying and fulfilling thing that you'll ever do in your life. So it is, in part because it is such an incredible company, and the retail part has been so incredibly successful. So, how do you come in and how do you come into a tech company, at my age and create an entirely new vision that's been so incredibly successful for the last 15 years. And so I think that's when I say it's been a journey because, other than leadership or culture or brand, I didn't really speak the same language at all. I'm not an engineer. I told Tim I am not a techie. But I think that we've kind of figured out a way to communicate with the 63,000 that we have in all of the 500 stores around the world, nearly 500, and also a way to communicate with the center. And by the center, I mean, one Apple, because there's, it's been the company has, is so huge. And I mean, every company is a Fortune 100 company in itself, right? So, but yet retail is where the best of Apple comes together. And so we kind of figured out a way to talk their language. And I started early on saying that, this is the smallest product that we produce, and just picture the store as the biggest product that we produced. And as long as I talk about it in terms of hardware, software, services, then I think we've been able to get everybody in the center and the teams around the world aligned.
And when you talk about hardware, you really mean kind of the architecture and the stores themselves.
Absolutely.
Are becoming. Say a bit about that. They are the hardware for you, are they? Into which the experience goes. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, and again, just to get everybody united, because the tenure in retail and the tenure in the center, everybody's been here for so long, and I didn't speak their language, right? I mean, I had a retail language, but they don't speak retail language. I mean, they speak tech language. And so I talked about the design of the stores, the hardware. And when we actually launched the new store design concept about a year ago, actually May 15th last year, Union Square was a bit of a pilot because that was already halfway and we caught it. But when we talked about the hardware, and then we talked about it as if it were a launch, and the 5 new features that we were launching in this new store design, and what we wanted the hardware to do, et cetera. And then very gradually got onto the software, et cetera. But if I talked their language, like I said, features, et cetera, then it just it's, and I guess simplicity is a virtue at Apple as well. So it taught me that.
And Dubai, that sounded like a real flagship moment for Apple Retail. So what was such a big deal about it?
Yes, Dubai, but I think that what we've been doing is we've been working for the last 3 years. Again, this product took 3 years to produce. This product takes 2 years before, you know, a new one comes out, and it's no different when you're building a gigantic product. The cycle, this has been, you know, actually since the first 5 years since they actually decided they wanted the space, but then 3 years since from when I started. So it's kind of Dubai, it's less Dubai. The reason that we kind of made a bigger deal out of it was it is actually the first that fully represents the new strategy for hardware and software and all of the services that we're unlocking. We happen to do it in Dubai. This is, again, Union Square was a bit of a pilot. Regent Street reopened in London, a bit of a pilot. This is the first one that is actually the new product and the whole new vision of what we'll be rolling out around the world. And you will see one of these a quarter now for hopefully the next 5 years. But it's a combination, and there happens to be an image of it. But think of these not as stores, because we took the word store out of our vernacular. I took it out 2 years ago, because these are such huge investments that Apple is making. And this, you know, 80 million people walk into this Dubai mall, and it's right in front of this huge fountain and you know, visible to the Burj Khalifa. And so the impact that this has on Apple for the entire geo is what is important. You know, again, Apple is so huge. Retail is only 0.2% of the company's distribution and about 15% of their sales. So
seems extraordinary,
you know,
because the splash that Apple Retail makes is much bigger than its proportion within the company.
Absolutely. So therefore, what role does it have to play for Apple to make an impact? But by the same token, what role then did we want it to play in the community?
And so, just to stop for a second on the flagship quality of the place itself, the architecture, the visibility of it inside Dubai, you were actually making something. When you say this phrase you use about it represents, that reaches the whole geo, you mean it's a flagship sort of almost on a global stage. Is that what you're really saying when
Absolutely.
you say that?
Absolutely.
And at the same time, it's a sort of meeting place in the community. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so we you know, made a fairly big announcement about Dubai, and again, the whole architecture of the store and the solar screens out front, and this 186-foot balcony that is this community space. You know, again, because we also run the online business, so we can tell you every trend of what's happening online, and then, you know, and we know that these spaces have to do something that you can't do online. And so, you know, 3 years in the making, what we had decided the first year, and we did this with all of the team members and Foster and Partners out of London, and we decided that again, these were Apple investments, but they needed to be investments we were making for the community, and then what was the role that we wanted them to play in the community. So this happens to be a picture of the balcony, but if you've been to Union Square, you know,
amazing.
There's a plaza out back at Union Square that Apple doesn't own. It's a beautiful piece of real estate that was horrible, and you know, we renovated it, put in a green wall with a fountain, you know, seating, beautiful, and we still don't own the space. It's community space with free Wi-Fi 24/7, et cetera. And so in these big places that we're building, again, what is the role? And we envision, and so Dubai is very much the same. We built a 186-foot curved balcony for the public to view the fountains. It's the number one, you know, most photographed place in all of Dubai, and that's kind of our gift to the community, because we've said we want these spaces to be like town squares. We want them to be gathering places where everyone's welcome. The glass is huge, everything's transparent, the way the doors pivot and open itself up into the community. It's funny, because living in New York and living in London and having 3 teens and you know, teens don't want to go to a mall today. They can get everything, you know, they want, however they want, faster, et cetera. And so it was actually interesting, because in New York, why did the kids want to go to Central Park? Why did they want to go to Washington Square Park? You know, why did they want to go to Covent Garden in London? There's always something going on. And it's human to human. There's always a kid playing a guitar. There's somebody sketching. There's photographers, right? There's always something going on. And, you know, it's actually not a coincidence that, you know, today that going on just happens to be the same thing, but right here. You know, 1.5 billion people see this every single day. And on an unaided basis, you've got like a 95% recognition rate. So I say this is actually the language that the next generation speaks. So all we did was take the 4 most important things they do on this and drop them down.
What does that mean? What does that actually mean you're doing in those spaces?
So this is the #1 camera in the world times 10. There are more photos taken, more film shot, more videos edited, etc. So stay on photography for a second. So we took you could take photo camera, we took that and dropped it down into what we call the avenues, which, if you typically have a town square, you have little shops around the square, each one representing something different. So just drop photography down, but it's more than that. Because who's going to teach the next generation how to be a better photographer, how to edit their videos, and at different levels, all the way up to a pro. So we actually had to reorg the team as well, and we announced a position called a creative pro. We've always had the geniuses, but the creative pro is to liberal arts what the genius is to technology. So we took these 4 passions, dropped them down into the avenue, announced 4 creative pros in every single store that have at least 10 years of expertise in that passion, understanding those apps, etc. And then we announced what's called Today at Apple, which is the software in the store, the entire store experience, and the fact that these 4 creative pros now would begin to teach 60 sessions a week.
Those 4 people.
And there's the 4 passions, and you could say there's a couple of photography, a couple to handle all the shifts, etc. But they will now begin. So the guy the creative pro for the App Store came down. He will now begin to teach coding. Swift is the platform that Apple is on. He'll start teaching the first module of Swift. It's a curriculum. Kids will come in on Saturday morning instead of watching cartoons and learn how to code, but there's actually a curriculum, 3 different times a day, 7 days a week, that anybody can come in, because maybe the onus is on Apple to help the next generation of iOS app developers.
So if I've got it right, and I think you've told me the 4 passions, photography is one, music is another, filming is another.
Well, that goes with photography.
That goes with photography.
Yeah.
So what are the 4 then?
Music, photography, and we took one from the iPad, art and creativity.
Oh, great.
Drops down, and music, photography,
and
art
the technology, the iOS
and the App Store.
So basically, what I'm hearing is that Today at Apple has anybody in that community, in whichever community you're in, can actually come in and learn whether they're beginners or whether they're quite experienced, the next level up, because you've put people in the stores to actually teach them. And that began with Dubai last week, but it's going to go further, isn't it? Is it going to roll out?
Yeah, we've been piloting it, like I said, in a handful of stores, and it's not even, it's for customers. Let me back up, because it's also so we said we wanted to create this town square, and what was the bigger purpose? What was the role we wanted it to play in the community? Great. So it is for customers at all levels, to your point, but it's also for entrepreneurs. Who helps the little guy? Who helps? 95% of every community is comprised of small and medium businesses. 95%, and they employ less than 10 people. So these big flagships, also one of the 5 features is a boardroom. And the boardroom is for all of the local entrepreneurs to come in and use. And again, our team will help them keep up to speed with technology. There's sessions called business circuits and business sessions, but it's also for educators. So, I said very early on when I started and was traveling all over the world, hitting the different stores, and I would tell our store teams, based on the amount of traffic that come into our stores and the amount of revenue that we do in these stores, I would tell the store leaders, and there's not one, there's like 5 or 6 store leaders for every store, and I would tell them, you're the mayor of your community. Like, you have to look at it that way, based on the number of people you employ and the revenue, et cetera. So therefore, do you know every school within 5 miles from you? Do you know every major small business entrepreneur that's up and coming in as well as knowing your customer base, et cetera? So this is where we set the stage for all of this. We've been working for the 3 years. So yes, we did launch. Again, it's called Today at Apple. It's the software in Dubai. So that was only the 4th store. So at the end of this month, yes, we are overnight going to transform about 419 other stores in one night, so that every one of them will become what I call a continuous learning center. and we'll launch. It's actually we did a mock-up with 3 stores to see how long it would take and the manpower, et cetera. So we could, everything at Apple has to be down to a science.
Yeah.
And so we are very comfortable that at the end of this month we will flip those stores in one night. They will have their avenues, they will have their demo products, their creative pros will step in. Today at Apple will launch. And the whole world will be welcome, and we've eliminated anything. You don't pay for these programs anymore. We used to charge, for some of these things, and everything is free, and it's a very formal curriculum, and that's really the unlocking of Today at Apple.
And that's a huge investment. That's a very big thing for you to do. And it sounds to me as if the thinking that you were doing is very deep about what you feel your role is in the community, what you feel Apple can be in a community. Mm-hmm. What is that? Can you describe that and why it matters, your role in communities where you operate?
Yeah, we did a lot of reading and a lot of feeling and studying, et cetera. And, I don't, and if it hasn't been reinforced at this conference, what automation is going to do, and the fact that isolation happens to be the #1 disease in the world today, and so I think that anything that we do, what were we trying to solve for?
Yeah.
And so we wanted to create these community town squares where everyone is welcome. The best of Apple comes together, but it gives everyone a place to go. Mm-hmm. So if you just need a human connection. And it's funny, for those of you who know John Gruber, he in Daring Fireball, he's in the Valley, and he got Today at Apple. And I love this quote that he talked about last week. This human connection where people have interactions with real people. In real life, No, but it's fascinating, right? Because everything has gotten so device oriented. So we felt we needed to create a place where people could come and connect with each other, learn, et cetera. But it's also not a secret that the arts have all been obliterated from education. And as automation comes in and disrupts a third of the workforce over the next couple of years, we actually believe leaning back into the arts at this point in time, which is what our customers use our products for. It's what they trust us to teach them. That's also why photography, why art and creativity, because we think those are going to be the great offsets for automation in the future.
And it's a huge investment in those communities. Mm-hmm. It's good business too, isn't it? In what way does it help the business as well?
Yeah, again, and I don't think that Apple's different, but when you have the share, in of your products in people's lives, and we know that they only use 10% of what these are capable of doing.
Yeah, put my hand up, that's definitely true of me.
And so, we always say that we want to build a lifelong relationship with them, and it's in Apple's DNA anyway. For those of you who ever had any trouble with your devices, 60% of our headcount in the stores is spent on service, not on selling, on servicing. And it was really interesting because 40 million people last year went to the Genius Bar.
Wow.
But half of those were with how-to questions on photography, on Apple Music, right, on iTunes, on the App Store. 20 million people had questions wanting to learn how to do things better. So that's also what kind of, they're already coming in for it. If we can help them use their products better, they'll be lifelong customers.
Yes.
Isn't that what you want in any great relationship?
And one of the things I think is really marvelous about hearing you talk about it in quite that way, certainly my experience in working with businesses who are sort of struggling, how do we deliver social value, is that so often it's thought of as a trade-off instead of financial value. Or if we just put a pause on that for a minute, we can do the other. But you're talking about a symbiotic relationship where what's good for the business is also good for the world around you that you're trying to influence. And actually that's in itself the values in action in the business. Is that how you see it?
Absolutely. It's not a box you tick. It's a part, like I said, our teams are hired for their empathy, for their compassion. They are there to serve every customer. So it's always been a part of Apple's DNA. And so I would argue that it's actually built into our operating model. All we've done is try to just evolve it, turn it up, so that it has an even bigger impact on Apple,
Yes.
but then embeds itself even deeper into the community. And honestly, I think the onus is on Apple to do this, but I think the onus is on every company to do it. I think that again, I fear for my kids. You fear what's going to happen in the next couple of years, and I think if every company were to lean in and almost reskill, if you will, in their competencies and things that are, wouldn't we all be able to get where we want to get to faster?
And one of the things that I find really exciting in listening to you talk about the emphasis on community with a sort of new paradigm almost and a huge ambition for it is that it feels very aligned with the way Apple has been thinking of itself in wider society for some years now. And I've been lucky enough, privileged enough to work alongside you and the team for a while on it. And it's very clear that when you, and spearheaded by Lisa Jackson and others in the company, moved into environmental responsibility, it was with a sense of ambition, with a sense of redefining what was possible, and almost challenging others to follow too, because you were definitely setting a new high bar for yourselves and for the sector at large. I would say you pretty much repeated that pattern in the supply chain. The feeling of, okay, let's take on board the challenge, the thing that could be a threat and a danger, set the bar high and see if we can set the bar for others. And now I'm hearing you talk about the same again in community, and I'm thinking you're using the word human responsibility, human impact. Is this really the next chapter in the way Apple's thinking about itself and its wider responsibilities?
We're learning right now. I mean, so we actually have started to measure. We've started to, how many lives we've touched, how many people we're connecting. We've just now internally started to, and we're meeting with some great minds in terms of, how do you measure, how do you, so, and I think to your point, we're being fairly daring and bold in terms of putting some things out there. But I think it would be incredible if someday we were able to. I think that, like you said, I think that Apple has really pushed the boundaries on environmentals and supplier, and I think that, in retail, there's 63,000 of our team members that are, touching and teaching and helping community, society every day, and I know the impact that we make. I know we're turning that up now. I mean, we're quadrupling the number of sessions and things that we're going to be teaching and focusing them. And I know we will have a terrific impact. And so it would be wonderful at some point to be able to put that out there and to try and lead the way in that space. But I think it's why we're all here at this conference. I think that's.
It's interesting too, because what you're talking about, I'm seeing a lot now of companies saying we've really got to work with our local communities. And that often means something small, something very local, but sort of typically of Apple, you've gone for something at scale and something ambitious and something with a big sense of drama about it. You're pulling people into the community in order to respond to the fact that people want to be somewhere where the action is, where human connectivity is, and so forth. And you're answering a problem from the core of the business as you do it. Do you think that that's a responsibility of leading companies? I've heard you say big company, big responsibility. How do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. I didn't join Apple to just open stores, and I told the team that, my ego didn't need to work for a big company. My ego didn't need to, and when I started, I said big isn't good unless big does good, and so that's kind of been the journey that we've been on the last 3 years. Everything we've done has led up to everything that we're launching now, and everything was centered around. We always talk about the customer, we talk about our employee, and we actually just switch that up a bit. Our employees are the community. They live and work there.
Yes.
And very early on, I partnered with a guy that I had worked a little bit with in London, Gary Hamill, and he wrote an incredible book years ago called What Matters Now. So we brought Gary in, and we actually crowdsourced with all 63,000 people at that point. because we had a day job. We were moving pretty fast and working with fosters and thinking about a lot of things. But then I actually wanted to hear what every one of our team members in the community thought we should focus on as well. So he was over here crowdsourcing with every one of them, thousands of ideas coming in from around the stores, and then all of his his analytical team would come back and get it down to 463 and then get it down to. And so just to make sure that as we were working here, they were working here. So the cool thing is we've launched this, they are the community. They live and work in their community, and they've been a huge voice in what we're doing. So now as we're launching this, they can also see their vision come to life. And I call it social leadership, because it is you can't do any of this in a vacuum anymore. You can't, they know what we need to do, and they want to do it. I mean, and it's funny, because since we started doing this a couple years ago, the retention rates have just skyrocketed. We're at 82% retention rate in retail, which is like 4 times what, any other retailer is.
And so there's a sort of feeling that it's meaningful to them to be part of this thing. And it's interesting because everybody who has Apple products and services, we know people love the products and services. But what I had felt listening to you and working alongside you and the team is that it seems to really matter to the people in the company that success means that the outside world feels that you're playing a role in society that they respect, and that that's actually core to the values of the company in action. Do you think that that is what leads to meaningful work? Because the theme really of this whole event is meaning in life, conversation shot through with what meaning is to you. Do you think meaningful work framed in this way is part of what makes for a meaningful life for you?
Yeah, for me, yes, but I think even more for Apple. I think that my favorite quote that Steve said over and over was that it was technology, when married with liberal arts, when married with humanities, right? That's what makes our hearts sing. And so all I've been trying to do, I, like everyone in the world, probably just admired and respected him, and he had that vision from the beginning. And so how does retail live up to that vision? And then Tim, the values that he has carried on in the company, and those values just permeate all the way down to everyone on the, everyone down, to our employees in the stores. And so, Tim talks about be the ripple. Steve talked about enriching lives, changing lives, and Tim has just carried that on. And I felt so honored to come in and to be able to, to use this incredible retail platform and just help propel those visions forward.
It's been a great pleasure to talk to you this afternoon. Thank you very, very much for being in conversation with me, and I hope that everybody else here has been as inspired as I have. Take care.
early or late.
Okay.
You can check your email. You're checking your email, Joon.
It's actually, I put the notes on there
Oh.
on an Apple device.
Yes, she had a very large Apple device.
Yeah.
Yes, was
Yeah.
that the new product?
I think she was actually generating some intrigue. We're all wondering, what is that
How
device?
big is that very large object? Exactly.
Leanna, you let us know when you want us to start. Or Mike, yes. Thank you. Okay, thank you. I think we can begin. If there's one thing that we all have in common more than using one of these Apple devices is actually the fact that if we're lucky enough, we're also going to age. My name is Joon. I'm president of Palo Investors, formerly a physician at Stanford. I was on the faculty there, and I've been at a hedge fund for 19 years. And with me today is Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn, president of the Salk Institute. She's one of the most decorated scientists in the world. Among her achievements, she's won the Nobel Prize for medicine or physiology in 2009 for her work on telomerase and the role of telomeres in aging. She also has been named one of the 100 most important people in the world by Time magazine. She's also the author of a book called The Telomere Effect. And today, we're going to be talking about both the book and Elizabeth Blackburn's role in really helping push the field of aging forward. So thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Joon.
Can you tell us more about your personal background, how you got to be a scientist, and your interest in telomere research?
Well, I grew up far away in Tasmania, which is the bottom part of Australia, and I probably had time on my hands, right? So I just loved looking at nature. I liked animals a whole lot, and I just decided living things were the most interesting thing in the world. And then I just got feeling maybe the molecules in living things were the way that you'd figure out how they worked. And so it just naturally happened that I never had a question. I wanted to become a scientist, and I knew biology was going to be at the center of it. And I just really wanted to figure out how all this was working. I read a wonderful book when I was in middle school about Marie Curie. Now, she wasn't a biologist, but she was a chemist, physicist. She won the Nobel Prize not once but twice, and so she was a great role model. But for kind of an interesting reason, she was also a mom, and she sometimes would homeschool her kids and neighbor kids, and I just love that combination of the person she was and then this scientist who was very she saw science as a very high kind of calling. So as a kid you get inspired by figures, and she was one. But it was because I loved just how living things were working.
She's an example of a notable basic scientist. Can you speak to the
Yes.
role of the importance of basic science and research?
Yes. Well, the U.S. is just invested in basic science, and it shows, because tremendous things come out of really understanding how nature works. Be it physics, be it chemistry, be it material science, be it biology, be it us. We're biology, but we're also so much more. We're minds and social beings, and just understanding all of that. To me, using how you can bring scientific thinking to these things just brings such a richer understanding of what humans are all about. And that's what I've loved, is seeing that evolution in the last few decades of more and more technological advances that let you do the kind of science that let you ask now really complex questions about how we as humans are. I started life with single-celled I started working my career, my science life began with little single-celled organisms, because that's all people felt they had the kind of technology to deal with in terms of molecular biology, and it's just grown and grown. So now we can really do wonderful research that touches quite directly on how humans work, which is way, way, way more complicated, and we're not there yet. But it's such a journey, and it's been such an investment that's been worthwhile, because it really yields the impact to look deeply into how things work, and then they can be translated into products, into health improving, medications, health improving, interventions, things that we do to improve the quality of life, because we're living longer and longer, as you said, and it's all about how do we potentiate these lives. Saying aging is like, oh, it's this terrible problem. I think it's an opportunity. It's really potentiating what you can do with these amazing brains, so long as we're kept in a sort of a healthy enough state that we actually can realize that potential. So that's how I see the research going, is to say, how do we maximize this human potential that we have in what is a demographically aging population worldwide. But we look more and more, and it's not a joke, 70 is the new 50, or is it vice versa? Right. 70, right.
Well, in addition to being a renowned scientist researcher, you're also a great storyteller, as attested by your book. Can you tell us the story of the moment of discovery for you and your colleagues?
Well, I co-authored this book with a health psychologist, Elizabeth Blackburn, whose specialty is understanding the role of severe chronic psychological stress on human mind's well-being and body's well-being. And there's a lot of physiology that happens depending on how your mind is, and your state of mind, your habits of mind. And all of this has been something that, when it met the field of telomere research, which is what we started in the early 2000s, suddenly we got a connection in a very real way that we could quantify in terms of how well our telomeres, which are the protective tips that protect the ends of our chromosomes. So I always say they're like shoelace tips that protect the end of your shoelace from fraying. Think of telomeres as what protects the ends of your chromosomes, which carry all the genetic material that makes every cell work well. So you need it working properly. And when those tips wear down, then the chromosomes, the genetic material, is not protected. Cells then say, uh-oh, bad news. They die, they send out alarm signals. And that kind of wearing down of telomeres, we live so many years now, it starts to take a toll. But what was fascinating, and why we wrote the book, was that we realized that while there was bad news about stress and negative sorts of, bad habits, bad sorts of things that happen in people's health-related activities, that while that would wear down telomeres faster, and then lead to the kinds of diseases that come from the fact that our cells no longer replenish, they senesce, they send out pro-inflammatory, sometimes pro-tumorigenic things. That happens, over the decades. But the good news was that this was quite malleable, and people could do a surprising number of, very doable things about alleviating that, so that you can actually improve your telomere maintenance rates quite a lot. So that was the empowering part. We just thought there's so much research coming from all sorts of different quarters, and that was all in these specialty journals here and here and here, and yet we're an integrated entity, and we wanted to make sure that it was all in one place, but heavily backed up by all the great science. But, I tell everybody, I didn't write this book for my science colleagues. They can read the papers. I wrote this book, as did Alyssa, because we wanted this useful information to get out there, because there was so much science there, but you had to integrate it. And we were just fortunate over the years to have collaborated with so many different people in different health and medical and clinical and just general scientific expertises, that we kind of could see the picture, because we'd been collaborating for, well over 15 years on these kinds of things. So we got a picture, we thought, we've got to share this. So we wrote a book, because that was the goal, was to share the information and make sure that, useful information was out there.
I loved your quote about science being a team sport. It really is.
Yes.
And the aging
Yes.
field certainly
Yes.
is. What are some of the things we can do to improve our telomere health? I think we all,
Yes.
we're all a little terrified learning about what's going wrong with our body, but in the book
Yes.
you really talk about ways to improve your telomere health. First starting with mental health.
Right. Well, so the word stress, it turns out, it's actually a really oversimplified word, because essentially, now I'm learning all of this too, of course, because this is my expertise came from molecules and cells and coming from that end of things. But having worked with colleagues, I've started to learn this. So I will relay it to you, which is that there's challenge stress and there's health stress. So I always say, we're up on the stage, we're under some challenge stress here, and this is good. Threat. Did I say health? It's threat stress. So there's really two different kinds of ways when a stressful situation comes in, people react. And people will have habitual ways they react, but it turns out you can learn with some fairly simple thinking about just how to approach it. Turns out you can relearn how to turn threat stress responses into challenge stress responses, and it's not rocket science. It's really just a resetting of how you approach questions. So that was the thing I found very interesting, was these kinds of things that you could do were not incredibly hard. You didn't have to get amazingly expensive gym subscriptions and great new Lycra clothing and do huge amounts of exercise. Actually just small amounts of habitually changing your habits over the long term, because we've got lives in decades and decades. Those were the things that actually affected the real sorts of changes. And the beauty is they're doable. Most health advice looks very daunting and things that you don't want to do, and there's every joke in the world about, living longer and not having the enjoyment and so forth. But the kinds of things that really turn out to be very useful and measurable in better telomere maintenance in cohort studies are things that are just small but habitual changes. And so to me that was very encouraging. And again, we thought this is the sort of information that should be out there, because there's so much health information out there that when it's quantified against how well your telomeres are maintained, which then in turn translates into probabilities of not getting, if they're better maintained, not getting cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, really interestingly, and some cancers and diabetes. Those things are, the better your telomeres are maintained, the lower your chances are of those things. That's not the only thing going on, but it is one of the factors in human lives that does affect your probability of these. And so knowing that is very empowering, and it's measurable in cohort studies. And so you get good guidelines about what kinds of interventions or changes in habits work. And so that was what was so interesting, that they were not extreme ones. They can just be things that cumulatively add up. So we talked about different areas of things that you could look at in your life, So it's everything, basically, there's nothing new here. It's basically everything your mother told you. Right? So sleep well, have a good attitude, get some exercise, eat decently, interact socially well with people, all of those things that we all know. But it gives some quantifiable guidelines as to amounts and so forth. So you can look at all of these and know that, making a few changes in any of them are going to be helpful. You don't have to change everything at once. So this is what my colleague, Elizabeth Blackburn, who wrote the parts of the book that, of course, talk about this, draws from behavioral science, understanding, what things are actually useful for making things change. Because you as a physician, I'm sure, told your patients you have to do such and such, or a terrible thing will happen to them, and they take no notice, right? So,
right.
so there's been a lot learned about what makes people actually want to make changes and have changes that stick, because that's the idea. So I've learned a lot.
Can we go
as
deeper
well.
in there
Yeah.
to play on Steve Jobs' quote we saw up there that
Yes, that was wonderful.
that DNA alone isn't going to, technology
Yes.
alone isn't going to solve everything. So in our body's case, DNA alone doesn't define who we are. There's lots of things we can do to our
Yes,
DNA.
yes.
So can you give us more specifics, like how much exercise is the right amount? You have a chapter in there talking about that.
Well, yes, because it was such an interesting question. So I'm going to put it in so nothing works by itself. We are the interaction of these things. But my favorite one is that in people who are under chronic stress, and there are situations in life like long-term family member caregiving, for somebody with Alzheimer's or a child who's got a chronic condition and the mom is the one with primary responsibility, not much help, things like that. So when these situations were studied, it was found that even as little as 15 minutes of just quite brisk, but work up a sweat a bit, exercise daily was enough to buffer the stress's effects on the telomeres compared with those who didn't have such exercise. So that's not an crazy amount at all. And I always like to say, if your lunchtime's short and you feel I have no time for exercise, you actually do have a bit of time to run up and down the stairs. So surprisingly small but consistent amounts in a sort of sensitized setting of somebody under chronic stress really could help. And in fact, another way we could look at it is to say that the benefit of exercise was about twice as much if you were, for your telomere maintenance, if you were chronically stressed than it is if you're not stressed. So it's context dependent. Another very good intervention study done in Germany where they actually did an intervention, looked after 6 months and asked about different forms of exercise, was that it turned out interval training had more effect on telomere maintenance capacity than did just weight and resistance. But another big study with many thousands of people where we did the telomere measures was just the number of categories of exercise you did. Just more and more, moderate exercise, vigorous exercise, walking, cycling to work, weight bearing. If you just added categories, the telomere maintenance just went up and up. So I think variety, and it wasn't especially dose dependent. I'm sure there's a threshold, but it doesn't seem very high before you start to see the benefits of the exercise on what otherwise would have been stress-related telomere shortening. So that's one kind of very practical example.
Mm-hmm.
The intervention for interval training, it was only about 3 times a week, I think, for 45 minutes. So again, not crazy amounts. Now, one does find that marathon runners do have very good telomere maintenance by and large. Mm-hmm. We all know that there's overtraining, and that's not from telomere research, that's from a lot of other work. But one can use it as a good kind of reliable, meaningful readout for what a dose of exercise or food habits and so forth are beneficial. Sleep, 7 hours at least, was clearly differentiated from 5 hours or less. So those are sort of 2 useful guideposts. It didn't say you had to have 8.5. And that mattered more, again, depending on how old the person was. So the older you were that became a bigger effect. So again, it's very context dependent.
You're making this sound all very doable for the rest of us.
The point was that actually was what this was science. I mean, this is measured things. It was not an opinion. That's what I love about it. I never thought we'd see anything, and so the data just came at us and came at us and came at us. And it's always best when that happens. When you come as a sort of, come on, there's not going to be anything there, and then to see data just coming at you, to me, is the most satisfying, because it says you didn't kind of squeeze the result into your favorite idea. The humans actually told us what the realities are, and then human genetic studies have been very useful in reinforcing that this is causality, that this is actually a contributory factor to the disease risks, and not just a sort of marker that goes along with it but didn't really have anything to do with the process.
We just heard there's all this encouraging data. How many people here would like to learn how to measure your telomeres. Okay. Well, could you share with us? How do we do it?
It's not really that useful because it's a very, well, I tell you that an 80-year-old more often has telomere lengths similar to a 30-year-old than not. You'll see, well, and you say, well, what's the use of this? It's when you look at the numbers statistically in well-designed large numbers, statistically reliable, that you see that you're changing the odds of diseases. And I like to make the analogy with smoking. So we know the decision should be don't smoke or stop smoking, right? So why do we know that? Because of a lot of studies in people. Do you need to take your own lung biopsy to convince yourself not to smoke? You know, you don't. You wouldn't get any useful information. You would still know that the body of evidence was smoking will up your chances of many cancers. It won't guarantee you lung cancer. Not smoking won't guarantee you freedom from cancer, but boy, it'll change the probabilities. So my feeling is there's no harm in measuring your telomeres, but there's a lot of, we've studied this a lot in our research studies. It sort of fluctuates up and down. There's a drift downwards, but you don't get a whole lot of individual information. But there's no harm. I mean, you know, won't hurt, but it won't tell you a whole lot. Where I think it's going to tell a lot, which hasn't happened yet, is when that measure starts getting combined with other measures. And there's some studies that have started coming out in, sadly, cancer patients who already have a diagnosis of cancer. And when telomere length, just in the white blood cells, shortness, you know, the degree of shortness was combined with just, you know, one or two other measures, it became a much stronger predictor of prognosis after you corrected for all the other factors. So when we think, you know, our long life and our longevity is now, these days, very dependent on how much we are able to not get or survive, you know, cardiovascular cancers, diabetes, you know, the biggies, right? Lung conditions. Anything that is upping our odds of not getting those is going to make us more likely to be in a longer health span. You know, we call it health span. And the interest in longevity, you know, how long can we live, you know, lives where we live our potential at its best is to do with our health spans. And so this is really what this science was all about. Not, you know, can we live forever? That's for another day, but you need to at least get through, you know, a good health span before we can even get to that part of things. So I'm all for, you know, making sure we have the highest quality of health, and this is one part of it, but you know, I know there'll be more going on. It's just the one part that we actually do have a real good handle on now for those long, long decades of human life. We understand that that's, you know, something that's really playing a quantitative role.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is leading to this surge of interest in the field of healthy longevity?
Yeah, well, I think it's the success of medicine, right? The success of medicine was to and you know, public policies that led us to have, you know, safer water and things. So now we're not so worried about, you know, losing. I mean, we are in some parts of the world, believe me, I don't minimize the seriousness, but the fact that we have sort of almost the luxury of this is because medicine and scientific advances in, you know, taking care of a lot of the infectious diseases. You know, we're really good at broken legs, and, you know, we're good at a lot of awful things that might have killed people. And so now we're in this stage where we have the luxury of looking and saying, well, you know, we now can start looking at the next things that are threatening our health span and therefore our quality of life, and of course indirectly our longevity. Mm-hmm. And so it's just where we are in terms of the way things have advanced. So it's a triumph of medicine that we have now got this ability to think about these things, and a triumph of research in so many areas that there's so many ways that we can start understanding what's going on. Mm-hmm. So you know, we dread what's going on in terms of, you know, the dread of Alzheimer's and the dread of cancer and so forth. But I really think that there's, you know, inroads that, you know, as you go into the fundamental science of how the brain works, mm-hmm. how cancer's worked, mm-hmm. you know, we're getting there. And so I think this is, maybe people have just started realizing that, we can look beyond just, surviving childhood and typhoid and smallpox and polio, things were the big dread things in the 50s. Polio was a terribly frightening disease for families in the 50s, and now most young people, barely have heard about it. So that's success that comes out of doing research and understanding how disease etiology is. This is now an understanding of a different kind of disease etiology. Only one kind of understanding. There's more to it than this, but it's one part.
That was Jonas Salk's work with the polio vaccine. Within the aging field now, what are some of the things going on in terms of research that's exciting you, that's very intriguing?
Yes, well, the telomere part, I love it. I think we've got our heads around some of it, but the big thing will be, how do you start combining that with, as I said, we're one integrated person, right? How do we start combining that with other things that really will make very big sort of individual predictions much more strong? But the other, and they may be genomic, they may be epigenomic. The epigenome is all of the chemical marks on your DNA that makes genes get expressed or not. And they get changed by life circumstances, as do telomeres. And then some of the very exciting basic findings in research that I'm excited about is how, there are proteins. Proteins, the molecules that make up our cells and do all the things that enzymes and so forth. Basically life depends on proteins. We're bags of very intricate proteins, and some proteins get constantly renewed, because they get sort of old and sort of shabby chemically, and so the cells renew them. But some don't get renewed. Some in our brains will sit around for decades, we believe. And they get a little kind of fuzzy, they're not great. And so that contribution to aging, and it maybe some of those lead to some of the, the brain disorders where you have proteins that have become, tangles and plaques and, junk protein. But this understanding of the way cells can replenish those proteins. It's just that our brains are kind of a little too lazy to do it. We live all these long years. We weren't evolved to clean them up. But cells have the capacity to do it. And if you could wake that capacity up, there's somebody at the Salk Institute, Martin Hetzer, who looks at this, and he knows that in your brain cells, they don't have the capacity to clean out these really ancient proteins. I call them the undead. They're the zombie proteins. You wish they weren't around, but they are. But the cells that gave rise to your mature neurons, they've got that capacity to renew them. So if you can just wake it up in the neurons. And so people understand a lot about how these pathways can get turned on and off. So I could see that we could maybe in the future just wake up those, clean out the garbage a bit, clean house a little, get something nice and spiffy and new for proteins. So I'm just thinking of one of the lines of research that is interesting. When telomeres get too short, they make our energy powerhouses, the mitochondria in our cells that deal with all our molecules that give us energy and that we metabolize well or not so well, not so well giving rise to metabolic syndrome, diabetes, that telomeres play into that. Love to know what else plays into that. And so again, working on metabolism and our energy powerhouses in the cells, I think those are going to be exciting. I could go on, but I'm just giving you a couple of examples.
Well, we can close on maybe on one note in the remaining time. It's a connection to, and we just heard earlier from Angela and Lucy, the human connection part, which was a really great section in your book. Can you describe the effect of human connection on health?
Yes, well, we know all these health behaviors, affecting our telomeres. So what about, do you affect other people's telomeres? We know how intensely social humans are, as we heard Angela talking about. And so we wondered, what would you do to somebody else's telomeres? And so on the really depressing end, children exposed to violence, bullying, racism, those were impacts that were measurable on telomeres dependent on the number of years of these. And then in adults too, similarly, people exposed to violence. The good news was people in very positive sort of long-term relationships, be they friendships, be they marriages, you could see these positive measurable effects on telomeres. And you know, something so ephemeral and hard to grasp, yet you could see effects on telomere maintenance. And one of my favorite studies was a study which was a very intense meditation retreat for 3 months. And what was assessed, self-report, was purpose in life and change in purpose of life. Something very hard to put your hands on. And that quantifiably, how much more people, you know, increased their purpose in life as they perceived it, quantifiably related to their telomere maintenance capacity change. We were just really impressed by that kind of thing, because purpose in life, as we heard, you know, is very often associated with how you interact with the world, what you give to the world, your relationship to the world. It's partly related to you and what you do, but a lot of it is what you are doing in relation to your, you know, your family, your society, your community. So I find it fascinating that these things can be not reduced to, but sort of shown to have this quantitative relationship, because it gives it a bit more, you know, solidity in some people's mind. It doesn't sound quite so woo-woo, you know, to some people say, well, these things do actually quantifiably relate. Our brain does affect our physiology, and this is one kind of measure.
Well, it looks like we are out of time. Maybe eventually we're going to all run out of time, but we learned today about how to make better use of that time.
Good pun.
Really exciting to hear about all the work that's going on. And thank you for spending time today. It's been very inspirational.
Joon. Thank you, Joon.
And I think we're going to, Dr. Blackburn will be at the pavilion, where she'll be able to sign copies of the book that are available.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you again.
Thank you.